I guess we're the least likely subject that you want to talk about today. However, as we all know, it is something we all have to think about because we all are mortal, and we certainly want to put this off because we don't want to talk about our own demise, and it's sometimes a little scary to think about it. And I'll suggest that it's very important, not for you, but for your survivors. So I'll talk a little bit about planning, and before I do that, I want to tell you what my qualifications are to speak to you. I've been a funeral director for 23 years. My brother and I are the owners of the funeral home. He left the room, so good. Oh, here he comes. So we're the 50-50 owners here at the funeral home. My dad still works, comes in every day to be with us, but by 2 o'clock he wants to go home and have his nap. So he's still here and involved. I used to be on the board at the Rochester Genesee Valley Funeral Directors, New York State Funeral Directors. Currently, I'm a Preplan trustee, so for the funeral home accounts that we set up money and place trust funds in currently at the funeral home, I'm a trustee for that bank. So every once a month we have investment decisions to make. We pool all of our funds for funeral homes throughout the state. It's about $700 million in the bank, and every month we're reinvesting about $20 million. We have to decide where to put this money to make sure we get a great rate of return for all of you folks, so that your money, when you put it in these trusts, earns interest to keep up with inflationary cost increases, which it does do. We're currently close to 2% rate of return, which keeps up with inflation.
I can help you with it.
And we can talk. And actually, Morgan Stanley is one of the banks that we do invest in. It's very safe, by the way. So if you put money in this vehicle, there's very rigid guidelines. We can't be oversaturated in one, like Morgan Stanley, for example. We can't have more than, I think it's 15 or 20% in any one bank that we invest as a group. And that bank is very well run by this New York State Funeral Directors Association. I'm also a current board member of the Greece Regional Chamber of Commerce, also now on the executive board for that. And I've been very active throughout the years. John Lippa is here. My first foray into community service was with John when we were at Lisle Area Revitalization Committee. We served on that board trying to help out the Avenue years ago. So I'm not going to talk about these yet, but this is going to be the framework of what we're going to talk about today. Why would you pre-plan your funeral? Just real quick, and I'll dive deeper into these. To explore your desires or needs, the needs of your survivors, which is probably the most important point, deciding on a final resting place, reveal your legacy to family and friends, and Addie said that earlier. Financial planning, develop a funeral budget, create a means to fund that plan. Medicaid Planning, which we just heard about, we'll talk about that a little bit from our perspective, as well as that funeral agent, which Gay touched on as well. So these are the things that you might be considering. I'm going to skip over this because we're going to talk about them in great detail here. So this topic now is going to be, let's go with cemetery considerations. This is for you. And now the first thing is, where are your family roots? Some of you aren't from Rochester. Some of you were born and bred like myself and lived our whole lives in Rochester, and there's no doubt we're going to be in Rochester for a cemetery. But what if you were born elsewhere? Where are your family members? For example, my family, both my dad and my mom's family, are all in Holy Ghost Cemetery. The founders of the funeral home, Francis and George Bartolomeo, Holy Ghost Cemetery. My wife's family, Holy Ghost Cemetery. So for me, it's home. I actually will spend time in Holy Ghost Cemetery. It gives me a lot of time, a pause, more or less. When I'm in that cemetery, I might, after a funeral, stop and just walk around and see all the family. And it's very peaceful for me to do that. So in cemeteries, that cemetery is all in ground. Some cemeteries have mausoleum space, which is above ground. And mausoleum space could be both full burial and urn burial. Columbariums are typically outdoors for cremated remains, and those are above ground structures to place your urn above ground. Cost of space. The least expensive grave, I think, in the area might be $650. Could be as much as $1,500 for one spot. Mausoleum space can be anywhere from, say, $5,000 to $10,000 per spot for a mausoleum space, depending on where you go. Prime real estate with mausoleum space, just so you know, you always pay most money for the eye-level stuff, and as you go up, it gets a little less expensive. So if you can touch the spot, it's going to cost a little more. If you can't touch it, it's going to be a little less expensive. So it's prime real estate. Officiants for funerals. Now, the reason why we're talking about this right now, maybe not your age group, the younger generations, a lot of them don't go to church anymore. So maybe a third of the population doesn't attend church. That creates some trouble sometimes. People come to us and say, hey, what do I do? How do I have a funeral? So what we've done, we've been a little creative here, and we've been celebrant trained. So the celebrant training would be creating a service based on your life. So we want to talk about your life and pull in features of your life that are relevant, like special music, maybe a hobby that's then, you tie it into the funeral ceremony, such as, having props in a room where you have your favorite fishing lure. You're going to see something a little bit here, the guy who's bowling. So you'll see things that can be tied into the funeral ceremony to help us kind of remember that person's life and make it person-centric and not religiously based. If you go to church every day, we definitely advocate that, having your clergy a part of the service. We don't want to step in and break that tie to your clergy ever. It's very important. Faith is very important when you pass. I think it's a time for reflection and spirituality. You really need to have that a part of your service, I think. Elements of a service, whether it's in the funeral home or in a church, we believe in these things here as being very important things to include. So when you're thinking about your funeral, this is a time to say, okay, what is relevant and important for me? Music. In a church, it's generally religious in nature. When it's here in the funeral home, it can be, or it can be popular music. Like one real popular one is Frank Sinatra, My Way. We've played that many times in this room. Readings, whether it be scriptures or possibly poems. Is there a poem you've run across in your life that was touched you, personally? Can that be then read by a family member for the service? That would be very meaningful to be read by someone in your family versus someone like myself, because it's delivered by somebody that's close and special to you. Eulogies. The person that knows you best might want to come forward if they can and speak about you. You all know your family dynamics better than anyone, so you might want to jot down, hey, I think that my son or my sibling might be the perfect person to speak about me. And they can share a story about you that's someone never heard. So someone attending the funeral can learn a little bit about your life by having a eulogy said. Video tributes, you see them all the time now at funeral homes. We have a TV screen over there. We gather up photos throughout someone's life, not just recently or even middle age, but even when you were younger. We like to have photos to see those black and white photos before color photography and see that person's life from younger years, middle-aged, and more recently. And those can be very meaningful tributes. Remembering time. Funerals, a lot of times people do want to share stories. Visitations here at the funeral home are just that. You remember some of those stories about your life. What was special, those funny moments, your hobbies, things that meant a lot to you. I showed you a picture of Mexico earlier. That's special to me. I've been there, I think, 4 or 5 times now, and maybe someday I will retire down there. But those are the stories of your life that make you unique and special. Symbols. Religious symbols, candles, you can see that right there. Candles are a very big symbol. It's a very meaningful candle lighting ceremony can be a part of a funeral. Other symbols that we can do could possibly be just giving out handouts and takeaways. For example, we had 2 stories real quick for you. One lady one year had passed, and one of her customs was in the springtime would be stopping by annuals for her own garden and plant her things, but she always bought excess. And she would go to all of her neighbors in her neighborhood and give them annuals to plant in their own garden. So for her funeral, we had a flat of annuals, lots of flats of annuals, that people could take home from her funeral. And it was springtime, and plant that flower in her memory for that whole summer. So that was really special. Another lady had a bunch of, at home, hundreds of stuffed animals. And they said to my brother, well, what do we do with all this stuff? And Mike says, well, bring it in. We'll put a little sign out saying, hey, take one home and remember her by these stuffed animals. And so what's important for you? What are your takeaways that you could do to touch someone's life at that time? Participants, very important. You military people who are here, having a military service at the cemetery, for me, means an awful lot. You earn that respect. You earn that to have the military, whatever branch you are in, to come and play taps, fold the flag, present the flag. The Monroe County Honor Guard, which is retired veterans who volunteer their time, come and fire rifles at the cemetery. The fraternal organizations, you might be an Elk or a Rotarian, and those people especially with the Elks. They might have a special ceremony where they come forward and say a prayer during services, whether it be at the calling hours, cemetery, church, wherever it may be, clubs and sports teams. Unfortunately, when younger people die, sometimes we have people who are a member of teams. You'd have them, they come in jerseys, and it can be very meaningful to have them support one another in such a way. Volunteer groups like Unity Health Foundation, a lot of people have done that over the years. But mentioning those people and making sure they know that, hey, one of your members has died, and maybe we do something special with you to honor that volunteering that person has been doing for many years. Work associations like the ones I listed before. Certainly one of the things we like to do too is notify people so that these associations are clued in that someone has passed, that maybe a meaningful person in your life is notified. So, family and friends, what are their needs? So the first slides were about you. You really can't forget the people in your lives, because I think this is actually even more important. For us, we're the person that passed, but what about our spouse, our children, the people closest to us? What are their wants and needs for a funeral? This, unfortunately, is probably the single biggest missing component of a funeral, is that dialogue doesn't happen. And sometimes people come to us and say, I really don't know what to do. I don't know what their wishes were. I don't know how to honor them properly. Or even conversely, someone, and men, and we're all guilty of this, men are very guilty of this comment here, just throw me out back, forget about me, put me in a pine box, put me in a paper bag. Unfortunately, that's funny, but sometimes it conflicts family members, like the spouse or the children, and they say, he didn't want us to fuss over him, he didn't want us to have a gathering. What I mean by a gathering is after someone passes, you live all these years on earth, and all of a sudden you just disappear. We don't gather, we don't say that something happened and someone's no longer here. Whether it be a church service or a visitation at the funeral home or whatever it may be, anywhere. You don't stop and acknowledge the death. I really, truly believe it's important. If there's one universal that I think I've learned over 23 years, is we need to stop. And we need to say, yeah, something happened. It doesn't have to be here. Yeah, it would be great to be here. That's why we built this place. But it could be anywhere. You've got to stop your life, at least for momentarily, and just reflect upon, heal, acknowledge the death. So a family meeting would be great. And I'm going to talk about this a little bit further. But if you can take one home, take home today, is get that family meeting, talk about, funeral services with your relevant people that need to talk about it. What other the family and funeral needs of the friends and family? What are the financial needs? Is it elaborate or is it less scaled down? Estate considerations. Start thinking about some of those things you heard earlier. So, I'm about to play a quick little video for you. The New York State National Funeral Directors Association put together this piece here because some of those things I just talked about that family meeting and gathering, they put this little video out that kind of reflect upon that.
What's this? Big Ed?
Guess there's a lot we didn't know about him.
The more you know about what matters most to your loved ones, the better you'll be able to celebrate their life when the time comes. Have the talk of a lifetime today.
So in your packet, there is a Have a Talk of a Lifetime thing in there that they put together that gives you an opportunity when you do sit down with family to go through those pages. There's actually two versions in there. One of them is more artistic, kind of like this one here, for people that have that artistic ability and might want to be a little more involved. There's also a shorter version on the right-hand side of your pockets there that for people that are more like us engineers out there that are kind of fact-based. But either one works. You don't have to do both of those, but I put them both in there for you. Your personality may be one way or the other, and it suits your needs a little better, but you don't have to fill out both of those. So the first step is have that family meeting. Get the right people in the room. Sit down and talk about your life. Big Ed was a bowler, so maybe it was a story that was many years ago that those young people don't know about. Share it. They want to hear about Big Ed. What was that? What did that mean? Complete that guide. Put those things that your legacy. Once again, that Addie talked about. What is your legacy? How do you want to be remembered, and how did your life matter to those who are alive? If a funeral doesn't bring those things out, I think we're missing an opportunity to tell that story. And I believe, after watching funerals over all these years, if they do take that home, it's a meaningful experience for everyone that's been there, and it makes it a much better experience that allows them to heal. Because let's face it, it's a loss, it's a grief your grief-struck situation, and how do we start healing? And that's one of the great ways to do it. The budget. You know, the first two people that spoke are really your first steps, because we can't really put a budget together for a funeral if we don't know that, you know, our budget is X or Y. So really, the first step is to talk with someone like Addie and then Gay to start planning your future so that we can properly budget for a funeral. So once you get to us, what do we do to set aside assets? Funeral trust, and Gay talked about that a little bit. We do the paperwork here. The bank is in Albany, so we fill out the forms, put the money in Albany. The nice thing about this is the protection of 2%. That's why we go to Albany. If you go local, you're going to get maybe 0.5%. So 2% is going to keep up with inflation. Very important to earn enough interest in your account. Insurance. Deb's here. She does insurance. Many people will have life insurance for a funeral, and that's great. So insurance would be in place. You can't ever have the funeral home be a beneficiary in New York State. Some states you can. So if you've heard these stories about insurance policies for a funeral, it really isn't for in New York State. It's for Pennsylvania. It's for some other states. But you can have your next of kin be the beneficiary of a policy, knowing that person is going to be the person in charge of the funeral. So with insurance, we also advocate that form that Gay talked about, appointing a funeral agent. So that funeral agent is just for funerals only. Whoever's in charge of your funeral plan, make them the beneficiary so that they can then pay for the funeral. You know, you leave it up to chance. So if you had two children, for example, and one's running the funeral and one's running the finance, you can get in trouble sometimes. So you want to make sure that that person has the funds available to them to pay for the funeral. Installment options are new, something we haven't done in the past, which we're doing with the pre-plan once again, is this. We're saying, okay, so let's say my funeral was $5,000 or $10,000, whatever it may be, and then say to you, okay, how long would you like to pay for it? Over 3 years, 4 years, 5 years. You can then figure out what your payment would be per month and have the bank take the money out of your account every month. You don't have to worry about it. So rather than come up with $5,000 all at once, we can do it over 3 years, 36 months, 48 months, 60 months, to make it a little easier for people. It is my belief that many people don't have $10,000 sitting around, and how do I pay for a funeral? This is one way of doing it. So Medicaid planning, probably about 50% or more of the money that people set aside in trust is because they have to. So that's where you get to this irrevocable versus revocable trust. Irrevocable is only used when you have to Medicaid plan. New York State legally says that to us, so we have to follow that rule. If you're not Medicaid planning, then it's a revocable trust. In New York State, and this is one of the great things about our state, we're overregulated most places, but here it's a very good thing. 100% of the money is yours while you're alive. If you have an irrevocable or revocable trust, the funeral home gets none of it until you pass. There are other states, like I'm going to pick on Florida because it's my least favorite state when it comes to funeral planning. If you were to set aside that same $10,000 today, and 10 years later you wanted to switch to another funeral home or another state, they can keep all of your interest in Florida. Not here. 100% of the money, 100% of the time is yours while you're alive. There is no risk to putting money in funds into a funeral trust in New York because it's federally insured. It can't be in a risky vehicle. It has to be FDIC insured. It's 100% yours while you're alive, and we take no money out of that until someone passes. So it's very safe. And at 2% interest, you can't get that in a local bank. Some policies can be kept, but a lot of times when people are Medicaid planning, a social worker will tell you that policy needs to be cashed in, the cash value then placed into those trusts. So that may come up when you're Medicaid planning, but there are some insurance vehicles where it's not possible, or not required for you to have to do that.
Speaking of life insurance, essentially?
Yes, correct. Yep. One of the little known things about funeral expense planning, so let's say you're about the Medicaid plan because you're going into a nursing home, and let's say there's $10,000 that you need to account for, you didn't spend it down, you got your own funeral trust set up. New York State allows you to have your children's or your spouse's funerals funded out of your spend down money, before Medicaid kicks in. So for example, recently I had a situation where a woman was going into a nursing home. She was in a spend down period. She had 2 children, and she got to $12,000. So what she was able to do is take $6,000 per child, place it into an irrevocable, it has to be irrevocable funeral trust for her children. So that money was then protected for them too. So there was a trust for her and 2 more trusts for the children. And that was an allowable funeral spend down process. And that was able to obviously help out our children. So a funeral agent, I'll share one story with you. When that first passed years ago, I had a situation where an individual had a poor relationship with his daughter. He appointed his neighbor as the funeral agent. So somebody unrelated to him was appointed legally to be the person that would be in charge of his funeral, all of the details for the funeral, the expenses, the plan, all the details. Well, on a Friday night, I get a phone call from the daughter, and I knew it was going to happen, but I had this document in hand, knowing that this other person was appointed. And the man told me I don't want her to have anything to do with my funeral, which is very sad, obviously. But legally, I had somewhere to go with it because I knew what his wishes were because he planned his funeral. I knew who he wanted to be in charge of his funeral. I was able to dig my feet in because I had that document to back me up. And I told her, I said, I would welcome you for all the funeral services, and I hope you would be there for your dad. But this is what we're doing, and this is what's been done ahead of time. And she never did show up, unfortunately. I was hoping that maybe that was one last chance that we would get her together to honor her dad's life, but it didn't work out. And that comes up a lot, too, when you have children. If you got two children and they're 50-50 if you pass, so who's in charge? You know, so that funeral agent will help in that situation as well. Once again, so if you have a life insurance policy that's going to pay for your funeral, you might want to think about having an agent form for that person so they can be in charge of the funeral and have the financial means to do so. So I'm going to come back to this. When is the right time? I suggest now for anyone. I myself have planned my funeral. I don't plan on going anywhere. I hope nothing happens to me. But what if it did happen? What if I did contract a cancer or something that's so common these days? A plan in place where I don't even worry about it at that moment. It's all done. I can just focus on battling cancer. Wouldn't that be nice to have that, not have to be one more worry, you know? So don't avoid the topic. Have that family meeting. Take those forms which are in your packet and meet with those important people. And once you have that meeting, then get together with a funeral director. Now, one of the things I want to tell you, if you already have a financial planner and you already have a will and an attorney you already work with, and a funeral home for that matter, I'm not suggesting that you talk to any one of us and break that relationship. But I will say this, if you haven't done those things with these people who are here, reach out to them, make an appointment, you know, meet with Adeline and Gay and us, and start planning. You know, don't put it off. You know, this is a moment when you sat down, you reflected. You know, don't let this collect dust. You know, make some homework, you know. So no 2 people are the same. We've heard this earlier, right? And no 2 funerals should be the same. We really hope we don't have a cookie cutter approach here. I don't want to have your funeral look like the next person's funeral. They should be unique. So don't wait. Start planning now. I would suggest too, if you want to set up an appointment with us, if I've convinced you that it's important to not procrastinate or whatever that word was, we can even see Ann, and she can schedule an appointment with you to sit down with us and talk about this stuff. Or come see us. We'll give you a business card and call us in the near future. And I want to thank you for being here.